We each share stories from our early journeys and the challenges we face throughout the dissertation processes with non-indigenous faculty members, particularly with issues of asserting and including an indigenous knowledge system and framework. These stories acknowledge the importance of understanding that we do not need permission to include ways of being as indigenous people in the process of conducting research and writing. In the first anecdote, we hear Stephanie's story. Stephanie is one of the first indigenous scholars in the United States in the field of higher education to be promoted to associate professor. Her story speaks to her challenges with the limited use of indigenous methodologies, as well as the lack of acknowledgement of need for indigenous voices in higher education scholarship. When I completed my dissertation, indigenous students in higher education, let alone indigenous knowledge systems and methodologies, were not widely discussed or acknowledged in our field nor at my institution. When I first began submitting articles to journals, I was asked to use a single term for indigenous people. I also had an article returned from a journal in our field because they could not find someone sufficiently qualified to review my article. Another journal indicated that my article was too narrow as it focused on Haudenosaunee College students. A national conference proposal was rejected because there was a lack of interest in this population. Since the early 2000s, the field of indigenous higher education students affairs has grown, and I no longer receive reviews such as those noted above. We have made great strides, yet we have a long way to go. The second anecdote provides Heather's descriptions of her experience discovering critical theories such as tribal critical race theory and critical race theory that were not taught in her doctoral courses. She also discusses her experience of using a decolonized lens in her research and having to justify and validate her own approach in her dissertation process with committee members. Throughout my dissertation work, I struggled with locating a conceptual framework that really felt like it fit my work. At one point, I came across Brian Bryboy's 2005 Tribal Critical Race Theory. Tribal trait, of course, had not been discussed in any of my courses, nor had critical race theory for that matter. So reading it was like an awakening for me in terms of my own research. It helped me to articulate what I had struggled to convey in terms of the unique issues of colonization for indigenous people in higher education. During my dissertation defense, one of my committee members argued with me at length about the use of the term colonization. They could not understand why I was not using the term assimilation, and they incorrectly viewed the two terms as interchangeable. The argument represented a complete dismissal of my view as an indigenous researcher, the use of indigenous knowledge systems, and the experiences of indigenous people. I was fortunate that I had the native faculty member on my committee to step in and validate my use of tribal trait and the term colonization. That was a salient moment for me. It solidified for me the need for more indigenous scholars who could conduct appropriate and needed research, develop appropriate frameworks, and defend the value of our scholarship in higher education. In the next anecdote, Robin shares her experience in including an indigenous research paradigm in her dissertation research and how that led to further scholarship on how to assert an indigenous voice in the writing styles for other up-and-coming indigenous scholars. I began my work in indigenous research methodologies when I began my dissertation journey by beginning to use the indigenous research paradigm and relationality by Sean Wilson, 2008, who encourages the perspective of research as ceremony, also encouraging indigenous people to view our own birthing and conceptualization of knowledge to be done through an indigenous lens. In this effort, my dissertation was based on indigenous thought and knowledge as seen through the eyes of the native students in the research. Since then, all of my work has included indigenous research methodologies, especially in the evolution and work of the book, Indigenous Leadership in the Higher Education. This book used indigenous methodologies and acknowledged the voice and writing styles of indigenous leader authors, as well as the acknowledgement of capitalization, indigenous and elder throughout the connote and importance of who are as indigenous peoples and the important role that elders have in our communities. Lastly, when indigenous leader authors utilize their own indigenous language, we choose not to italicize it because in APA standards they see italicizing for foreign language, and we acknowledge our indigenous and tribal language as original language, nor foreign but a birthright. As indigenous scholars, we have the opportunity to use our voice and give power to the voice of those who we work with the present. We are the voice for current and future students and scholars to make an easier pathway for them. In the last anecdote, Charlotte shares her experience of being able to insert her own tribal epistemology and acknowledge systems in the academy and how she grappled with the validations of their use. This led to her own dissertation, which acknowledged the indigenous dying tradition closely tied to her family that can be lens to inform her research. An early challenge I grappled with was culminating the capacity to question afresh matters long discussed in dying creation narratives and to understand their significance to contemporary conditions of struggles within our life worlds.